So welcome everybody to night 2 of Common Ground. I'm really glad that you're all here. Some of you, most of you were here last night, and that was fun. And I'm really super excited to have Julia Curry here with us tonight. Julia is the co-director of the New England Resident-Owned Communities program at Cooperative Development Institute. They just helped their 60th resident group buy their park to own it as a cooperative, so congratulations. She's worked in the housing cooperative field since 2007, first with multifamily, so like apartment building co-ops, and then joining ROC in 2019, so the division. She comes from a family with business and legal background and a strong belief in fairness and community. Working with housing co-ops lets her put all of that to good use. She lives in Vermont, and when she's not working, she likes to be out and about in the beautiful surroundings of her home. So welcome, Julia. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I've been looking forward to this. It's kind of a neat opportunity to interact with a different group of ROC leaders. So I appreciate that. And I haven't presented on this topic through Zoom before, so I'm going to try a couple things and we'll see how they go. I know that Kathleen was able to email out the files that I'll be using, but the High Wire Act will be trying to work on a spreadsheet via Zoom
in real time.
See if anyone's on their phones. We'll see how that goes. Everyone see that?
And I will monitor the chat. So
Great.
would you prefer that people save their questions until you pause or chime in when they
I'm happy for people to ask questions in the moment. If it's something that is actually going to come along in a later slide, I'll just say so.
Okay. All right. So
yeah.
I'll monitor that and interrupt you if I need to.
Thanks. So the job tonight is to talk about capital improvement plans. That's the term that ROC-USA uses. Which is, so capital improvement is kind of a jargony term. But we're talking about capital work, which I just think of as like the big ticket items as distinct from, your regular operating costs that you're always accounting for, and maintenance and plowing and things like that. So the first thing, I don't know how well you all can see this or whether I can enlarge it. Good question. I wanted to show you, this is a bill that one of our communities got earlier this year for a little over $66,000. And this was a bill just for one segment of capital work that they've had to do in the past few years. They've actually had to raise and spend, I want to say close to $500,000. They're in their 5th year of operation, and when they bought their community, they knew that they were buying a ton of work that had to get done. I'm curious whether that's true of any of the ROCs that you all are leading. Are there people here who were part of, converting your community, and did you know that you had some big ticket expenses as part of that deal?
Oh yeah,
I'll call on
all of us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're toddlers, 2.5 years old, and so we were undergoing major work here.
What kind of work?
Infrastructure improvements. We've removed 30 trees in order to install the city water, connect to city water. We have a private well right now. We're going to cap the well, put in city water. We're going to improve the sewer lines, and then we're going to repave. It's about $2 million.
There you go. That's a great example. How many lots are in your community?
We have 50.
Okay.
35 are occupied.
Wow. So you're going to be able to
planting a ton of new homes.
Oh, right. That's a whole other piece of work, so to speak. So you're going to be connecting to city drinking water, city sewer?
Yeah, correct. We have city sewer already.
Have it already.
We are connecting the city water system.
That's really fortunate that you're able to do that. Right. But it's a lot of money. $2 million.
Yep.
So I'm curious whether people on this call, would you say that you know the age of the major infrastructure systems in your park? So it sounds like Bev has a good idea.
1938.
Wow, there ought to be some kind of prize for that.
Old and moldy.
When did Stonegate come online, Dan?
Probably about the mid-70s.
Okay.
Mhm.
So
And
newer.
so all your systems are from then, when you bought the park, that was the case?
I believe so. I wasn't here for that, but
Mhm.
just talking to the long-term residents who have been here for some time, it's probably started about the mid-70s, and the sewer system I think was upgraded since then, but not the water system.
Mm-hmm. It's a good example. So, yeah, of course, each community has its own setup, right? Some are able to connect to municipal sewer or drinking water or both, and that is the dream, I would say. But a lot of communities have to manage their own systems, and the electrical lines are can be a whole other story. I know in Vermont we have a lot of communities that where it was a very DIY attitude toward starting them up, right? Kind of patchwork of systems. Maybe there wasn't code, or if there was code, it it was honored in the breach, as they say. So we see a lot, we see a lot of systems that are old and sometimes potentially dangerous. So those are the types of issues that we're talking about tonight, right? So how would you know the age of the systems in your park? Especially since most of it's underground. So that one way that a lot of communities do know is that there are members who have some knowledge of it. There are a lot of people in the trades who live in the parks, and so they're able to, have more than a layperson's assessment of part of what's going on. And sometimes that's because they've kind of had to bootstrap, keeping things functioning. But when the community, anytime residents have purchased a community, one of the steps in that purchase process is getting what's called a property conditions report. And that is an engineer's assessment based on what they're able to look at. So it's not the last word around, the conditions of the infrastructure, but it is very helpful information. Whoop, didn't mean to do that. Do I know how to go back? There we go. Yeah, it's a helpful starting point. So when you get a conditions report, part of what they're doing is they're trying to estimate the age of those systems and what's called the useful life, basically how much longer you can expect them to function well or well enough.
Mhm.
So that is kind of the baseline of information that folks get when they first purchase the park. And even if it's not complete, it is critical information for boards to be thinking about, understanding what they can, and using as the basis for a plan, right? The worst plan is no plan. And sometimes this is unavoidable. I mean, sometimes communities, purchase the park and within the first 6 months, something just dies, right? And there wasn't time to plan for that. How have any of you had that experience with your parks?
Oh,
We had to replace our well pump, meter, and panel
Mm-hmm.
in the first 3 months.
Mhm.
Not knowing that would be coming down the pike.
Nope.
Yep. That's an unpleasant surprise, right?
Yeah.
Were you on that founding board, Bev?
Yes.
Yeah, I bet that was stressful.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you recollect about how much that cost? Ballpark.
Sorry, it was about $25,000.
Uh-huh, okay. And did you have money in your reserves to cover that?
We had just purchased the park. No,
Yeah.
we didn't have any reserves.
Didn't have any reserves. Okay. Yeah, so sometimes some communities are able to start off with what's called capitalized reserves, or basically some money from the mortgage loan. There's enough money in the mortgage loan to put a little bit in reserves at the start, you know, but in some communities that's not a reality. So that's kind of the worst case, right? And you basically have to scrape up the money. Did you have to pass an emergency rent increase around that?
We did have to do a rent increase, but we did have a little bit of reserves in our financing for the purchase of the park.
Okay, good. Yeah. So yeah, that's not fun, right? And you couldn't avoid that at that point, obviously 3 months in. But what boards can make their best effort to avert that in the future by doing the capital planning, right? So what capital planning does for you is it's not a total perfect crystal ball, but it lets you estimate what might happen and how far out and about how much money you're going to need for that. And so even if you're not spot on, you know, maybe you got it 85% right, but in terms of the impact on lot rents, that matters a lot versus what had to happen there at Woodlawn, right? So the capital improvement plan, this is it's a tool that ROC-USA has created that TAs can help boards, you know, get to know and learn to use. It's a spreadsheet, and we're going to see it in a minute, that projects out over 10 years. So from the date of buying your park, it projects 10 years after that. And ideally, you're going to continue to update it so that it keeps projecting over 10 years. That's the dream. So it's going to list out, you know, what are the types of capital work that you anticipate needing and when. You want to find estimates for those costs, and the property conditions report might or might not include those, and they might or might not be very current, you know, so that's an area that where ongoing research is smart. And then it helps you track the money, right? How much money you started with, how much you're contributing to your reserves against those expenses, those big expenses that are coming up, what you're spending actually, as opposed to what you planned. So it's a very handy document, and there it is in all its beauty. I don't know, are folks able to see this at all on the screen? To the extent that you can read some of the text. Yeah, great. Okay, I'm pleasantly surprised.
And if folks, sorry to interrupt, Julie,
yeah.
but if folks, you can zoom yourself in if you are having trouble seeing. Maybe that's too much to get into right now, but there
Sounds
is
like
a way to do that.
Do you want to
Just
tell
a
people?
little-
Sure, sure. So if you're looking at the top where you see, in my view, it says Julia Curry screen, there's 3 dots next to that. If you click that, you can, it drops down a menu and you can click zoom ratio, and then you can zoom in up to like 300% if that's floats your boat.
We can't see that.
Thank you.
Oh. Uh-oh. Plus I'm going, there we go. I think I just messed things up.
You might have to go back a slide.
There we go. Well, I'll tell you what, I know that Kathleen also emailed this out. So I think maybe what we're doing tonight is for demo purposes. And then once people have seen this, I definitely encourage you to open this up on your computers if you have computers, or, you know, if you have a screen big enough to make it worth doing. And kind of check it out and get familiar with it. So I'm actually going to stop the share because that's the PowerPoint and go to.
Do you want to talk a little bit about why it's 10 years?
Yeah, but give me 1 minute because I'm just a total monotasker. So I can either navigate or talk. Okay, that's where I'm going next. Let me reshare. Yep. Let's see what happens. Okay, so this is the actual spreadsheet, not just an image of it. Why it's 10 years? I would love to talk about that, but to be honest, I don't really know. Do you know?
Well, my understanding is that it's 10 years because at the end of 10 years, the lender anticipates that you will refinance.
Mm.
And so then a new one of these will be created.
That makes a lot of sense. And I will tell you,
I know we're due to refinance in March of 26, so ours will be coming up shortly.
there you go. Yep. Thanks for that. I hadn't connected those dots. I'll tell you that in Vermont, some of our communities that have big projects, they did end up refinancing early, as part of how the kind of whole total package of how they're financing those big projects, right? But that is going to be very dependent on the interest rates that are available at the time.
And if you do refinance early, it's not going to be 5 or 6 years early. It's going to be a year early, generally.
Well, actually, a couple of them, yeah, they
Really?
refinanced
Oh,
like
really?
year 5 or 6.
Oh,
Yeah.
really? Okay.
I mean, just because it made sense,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's good to know that that's an option.
Yeah. I mean, it might not be so attractive now. That was last year,
Right.
or a year and a half ago. So let me walk everyone through this so you can see just how useful it is, right? This particular one has a nice color key, so that you can mark for each project kind of which stage it's in. So what you'll see here in column E is several that were in green, which means, one step in that project happened in that year and it's ongoing. You see one project that's marked, that's blue, the water distribution. So that was completed and they must have been very relieved because I'm sure that was costing extra money that then they didn't have to budget for, right? You also see one that's red, tree management, where there was an intention to do tree work in that first year, 2022, and then in the event they didn't do it. So those are the color codes. And then
So if I can interrupt, when I look at this, it looks like maybe the reason they didn't do that was because they overspent on their electric meter panels and on their oil tanks.
exactly.
Well, they saved some money on their water project. So.
They did. There was a little bit, there's a little pro and con,
But they spent a lot more on their septic.
A lot more.
From the 2,000 that was budgeted to 12 and a half.
Exactly.
That ate a lot.
Yeah. And that's right. And that's the kind of unpleasant surprise you can get in year one. And not the worst one necessarily, but year one is definitely a high risk. You don't necessarily know what you bought. So that's exactly right. And what I love about this spreadsheet is, here's the plan. Column D, this was the planned work. And then yes, here's what actually happened. And you can infer, as you did, why that was. What I also want to show you is down here toward the bottom, when you look at row 20, right, this shows the total expenditures. So first of all, this shows like, if they did all this work at once, it would be about $250,000, which I've seen much worse.
Mhm.
I'm thinking that's pretty modest for 10 years, right? So if they followed the plan in year one, that was expected to cost $71,583, but in actuality, they did spend a bit more than that, and still with not being able to complete everything they wanted to, right? Then you see after the total expenditures, this spreadsheet allows for some contingency, which is really smart, right? Just a buffer. It allows a 5% plus an
So,
inflation
Can
factor.
I pause you for a
Yep.
moment for people who are less
Sure.
familiar with the terms? So
Yes.
plus contingency is your, and it's just a buffer in case there are cost overruns.
Yeah, I mean, basically in case it costs more than you expected.
Yep.
Right. And the way that, I think this is a smart way. By definition, you don't know what's going to cost more than you expect, right? So instead of trying to break it out item by item, what this does is just say, let's include this much buffer.
Mhm.
And for instance, during the pandemic, we
It's the
saw
opposite of a profit margin.
a loss margin. That's good. Yeah, in the pandemic, we saw costs going kind of crazy and become very unpredictable.
Right.
Right. So I think that maybe before the pandemic, these plans had a lower contingency percent than they now do. Right. So you might adjust that as conditions are changing over time. Then there's also an inflation factor. So it's good to have both of these. And the inflation factor comes into play like over the 10 years of this plan. It's like cumulative, right? It's like compounding. So you really want both of those. And, if we were still in a time when inflation was continuing to rise, maybe you'd want this to be higher than it is in this current spreadsheet. So counting all of that, right? For the plan in year one, they said total expenditures would be 71,583, but with contingency and inflation, actually closer to 77,042. And then when you look at the actual, that is in fact where it came out, right?
Oh.
So that was kind of interesting. Then I'm going to go down, and this is kind of like, this is really the pay dirt of this spreadsheet, because it's like, well, what's happening with our money in relation to all this work? So this community, when they signed their, when they closed on the purchase, they did have money that was deposited in their reserves at that point, $100,000. So that's what they started with. It's sort of like the bank and Monopoly, right? And then there is a plan, an assumption, and I'm sure this is in their loan covenants, that they're required to contribute to the replacement reserve account. And the requirement looks like $1,000 a month, $12,000 a year. We also see that there's a projection additional from cash flow. And that means basically the money, I think that ROC-USA has been calling it surplus, which is not like a stringent accounting term. But, at the end of the fiscal year, hopefully you're in the black. And so the, cash flow that you had left over from that, very often the loans require a certain dollar amount from that to also go into your reserves. Do folks have a sense of why that is, or what the upside is of having that arrangement?
What is the upside of it?
So the upside is this. If you didn't do that, you would have to raise lot rents higher to make bigger contributions throughout the year. I don't know if you all are borrowing from ROC-USA Capital, but I know that they have this requirement called the debt service coverage ratio, where basically when you approve your budgets, there has to be 10% revenue above your break-even point. So they require you to budget that way. So hopefully you are going to have a surplus unless something, really bad happens in the course of the year financially. So what they're saying is they have that requirement and you're meeting that requirement with the budgets that you draft and they approve. And so at the end of the year, you're going to have this money left over, hopefully. You put it into the reserves. That's better than kind of let's say they required 36,000 to go in the course of the year. That would be 3,000 a month that you had to contribute every month in the course of the year. They would still require that 10% buffer in your budget. So you would be raising your lot rents more to achieve that than with this system. I don't know. Did that make sense? Not really. Yeah, it's a little nerdy. I don't know, Kathleen, if you feel like you can take a crack at it.
Well, I think the way that I talk about the replacement reserves is it's an enforced savings account. And so, although it feels paternalistic, the lender does it because there are too many co-ops that left to their own devices wouldn't do it at all, right? They would just say, we're not going to spend that money. And then when you need it, it's not there. So it's an enforced savings account. And they've observed over years that when a co-op has a surplus at the end of the year, most of the co-ops that we work with at NCF, the requirement is 50% of your operating surplus gets swept into your reserve accounts. So it's just adding money to your savings account, basically. And if you never have to spend it, great. It rolls over to the next financing period and puts you in a better position, or you can apply it perhaps toward your mortgage balance or something like that. If you have enough surplus, that would be a discussion to have with the lender. But the lender's opinion, of course, is that the more money you have in reserves, the prettier you're sitting, basically, the safer you are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is definitely true, because again, unless you have all new infrastructure, you're vulnerable to nasty surprises, right? So you want to have a comfortable savings account here against that.
I mean, if you theoretically get to the end of your mortgage, and most of them are 25 or 30-year mortgages, so it's, yes, you'll get to the end of them and pay them off, then it's going to look great for your lot rent at that point, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, that depends a lot on what the infrastructure situation is, right?
Right.
Because, and this is getting a little into another related topic of how, if you have these huge infrastructure needs, how do you finance that?
Right.
This reserve isn't going to pay for your $2 million job,
No.
right? So that is a good thing for everyone to understand. This is like one necessary component, but not the whole answer if you really have those big projects, coming down the pike.
Yeah.
So some of our communities that have those big projects, what they've been able to do, and this is somewhat state specific, is hire consultants who know how to raise public funding money. And it can take years to put together the money from a lot of different sources. Like there's some money from HUD, the federal agency, that goes through state housing agencies. And then there can be money from the EPA that goes through the state's natural resources agencies. And it's putting together, applying for these different programs, putting that all together, meeting their different requirements. So that can take some years. And sometimes the co-op does have to take on some debt as part of that. It's typically really low interest and on good terms, but nonetheless, it could affect how long it would take them to pay off their mortgage altogether. So I hope I'm not getting too far in the weeds with that. But this is
Just-
like, yeah, go ahead.
So just on the question of the cash flow sweep, I I guess my understanding of it was more like in the years where it's a pretty good year and you have that surplus, you can sweep it over. But if it is a tough year and your expenses and you don't have a lot of extra income after your expenses, then you that requirement can be waived.
Mhm.
So I guess you're taking advantage of when it is a good year to save.
Thanks. That's a very elegant way of putting it. Yeah.
So there is a question in the chat about the inflation factor, and I don't know if you have an opinion on this or if other folks who are on this call have an opinion about what that inflation factor should be, 2.5% or 3%, or maybe more. Does it change from year to year?
I would say it could change from year to year, and I think groups should look at it.
Mhm.
I don't feel like I don't feel like I have enough expertise to have an opinion on, what it should be.
Yeah.
Yeah. If anyone else has that, I'd love to hear it.
Molly has her hand up. She has an opinion.
I don't have an opinion, but I do think what I like to point out about the inflation factor, I actually just left another meeting with a board meeting with a ROC, and they literally use the phrase like, it's never gonna get any cheaper. And I feel like I need that on like a bumper sticker or something. And we see that played out in the inflation rate, right? Is that like the assumption is everything's just gonna get more expensive. So what costs you 10 grand this year, 10 years from now might be 15.
Mhm.
So something to keep in mind as you're sort of going through this process. So I do have an opinion, but it's not on inflation rates specifically.
But yes, it's definitely important to factor that in, right? Yep. So I wanted to make sure people are seeing how some of these numbers are running here and it'd be nice if I had my glasses on. Line 28, right? So this community started out with 100,000. They were supposed to also contribute 42,000 in their first year, but in fact, they didn't do that. So this is a good example, right? Where the 12,000 is what they're paying out of their operating budget. $1,000 every month is coming out of their operating budget into this account. So that's a given, right? That's just a standing expense. The idea was if they had enough surplus, they would then at the end of the fiscal year put in another $30,000. Well, it turned out apparently they didn't have enough surplus, so they didn't do that, right? So instead they put in 21,000, and then taken together with what they spent that year, right? The projection, the plan was they would end the year with $64,000, $958.44 in this account. And instead, they end the year with $56,000 in it, right? So again, in the first year, the first couple years are hard to predict. So that's not shocking. But would you want things to continue that way year after year? Clearly not. So looking at now year 2, right? The plan and the actual. So they decided, okay, we can do without road work this year. Just, they did what they had to in the first year. The septic is continuing to give them more trouble than they anticipated. They're done with the water distribution project. Great. The electrical meter panels, this can be very costly. So that was higher than what they had projected. And the oil tanks right off the bat were a little higher than what they had projected. Tree management, they held off in year 1, but they clearly felt like they had to, oops. Here's someone's comment that popped up. Okay. They felt like they had to get it done, which I will say that in our communities, we're seeing more and more storms. And the tree work is becoming more and more important for them to attend to. So that, tracks with what we're seeing. So here we go. Total expenditures in year 2 were actually quite a bit higher than the plan, right? The plan was 49,583, but they had to spend 66,735. They again contributed 12,000 in the course of the year, coming out of their operating budget. And at the end of the year, the surplus, they still weren't at the surplus level that was hoped. They contributed a little bit more, 23,000, a little bit more than the prior year, right? 23, but it's still lower than the plan. So now if we go to the bottom line, it's looking a little bit dicey now, right? What they have left at the end of the year is about 24,265.
Left in their reserves.
Thank you, left in the reserves. Yep. So this is why this document is so helpful, because boards are usually pretty good about looking at their financial reports for their operating budget. And most of us are a lot more familiar with the operating budget level of thinking, right, in our daily lives. Like, we're used to tracking our bills and keeping a close eye on that stuff. But, most of us don't have to think about this level of work and expenditure in our daily lives. So this is a little less familiar. And that's why checking this tool every year is super important for the long-term financial health of your community.
There isn't a corollary to this in our personal finances, so I think that's why it's kind of a less well understood account and thing to track.
Right. I mean, unless someone happens to have experience like helping to run a business, or if you're self-employed and you have assets, like maybe if you're a truck driver and you own your truck, then you're in the habit of thinking this way, right? But otherwise, not so much. Yeah. So if I were working with this community at the end of year 2, I might be encouraging them to think about, it could be time to contribute more than 1,000 a month from the operating budget to start building this replacement reserve back up. So that's the signal I'm seeing from these 2 years experience. Now in year 3, maybe they're not expecting to need quite as much work as they did in the first 2 years. So here we're looking at all these lines in yellow. They're hoping it won't be as much, like they don't anticipate as much work on the electrical panels. However, we've seen that the septic is consistently costing more than what the original property conditions report projected, right? So that seems like it's still a question mark. So yeah, so this board, this board would want to really do some focusing in and thinking about this, and possibly also at this point in owning the community, they have a better handle themselves on the conditions, so they're not only relying on the property conditions report that they got at the start. So it's great for both planning the work, but even more so planning the money. Right. And when you do that, you have a much better chance of avoiding the emergency lot rent increase, or, having to hike the rents, which is just so destabilizing for people. So that's a walk through this spreadsheet. And I don't think I need to go back to the PowerPoint, but I thought it might be useful to also talk about a little bit about those other options for financing really large projects. But before we do that, I wondered if people had more questions or thoughts about just this process of, maintaining and updating your capital improvement plan. And Molly, Sam, feel free to, Molly, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I And I think Kathleen and I talked about this when she was conceptualizing this workshop too, is that I have usually see the capital improvement plan as a very static document. Like, we did this at closing and this is what we're supposed to be doing. And I even just adding these actual columns to me is like a revelation. I'm like, why don't we have those normally? Because of course, just like your operating budget, you would be tracking budget versus actuals. So of course we want to be tracking year to year. And the color coding I think is really wonderful too, of like, oh, we didn't have the money to do that this year, so we punted it to the next year, or what have you. This just makes it super simple. So yeah, thanks for this
Because
document. It's great.
I think
Well,
what
Credit, let me
remains,
just say, Kathleen, that credit for that goes to David Eady and the folks at ROC Capital.
yeah,
This
yeah.
is their draft of this new format. And it's
Oh, very cool.
everything you're saying is spot on.
Yeah.
It does a lot more than the original document did. Okay, so
And I want to acknowledge my colleague Sam, who has done a lot of work on the way we present it internally here, and we've put some of those documents into Box and where the ROC staff have seen them. So
nice.
so we might be influencing one another, which is nicely cooperative, right? We like that.
I like that.
I think that the piece that becomes aggravating for boards is from the side that they often see, because they don't work with this document as much as maybe they should. But from their point of view, it's often, well, we need this done, and we've been saving money, and it's our money, and we should get to spend it. And so we go out, we find contractors, and we get bids, and we send an invoice off to the mothership in New Hampshire, and Andy Jaffe says no. How can Andy say no, we can't spend our money? You know, and they get pretty upset, and understandably so. And so I think that it's helpful to understand what it is that Andy or the lender is looking at, and how you can streamline your ask to get approval. And that gets to what Molly was talking about, this being a living document. And you're not chained to the numbers that were issued when you bought your park, but they are informed estimates. And so I wouldn't just disregard them. You know, they're advice you paid for, and it's worth listening to that advice. But it's also, the better you can understand this and how the lender uses it, the better you can work with it to get what you want done.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can, Julia, scroll over to the right of this document to year 10.
Yes.
So what Andy looks at is that bottom line in year 10, and he wants to see that there's still money there. That you have, you've spent money, but you've spent the money in the same proportion that you have saved the money, if you will. That by the time you get to year 10, you still have money in your enforced savings account. And that is really important to the lender to see.
So this is row 31, T31.
Yeah.
Yep.
And of course, it's hard to tell right now because, you know, a lot of these numbers are going to change, but Andy looks at a ton of these. You know, there's north of 350 ROC communities nationwide that are financed by ROC-USA Capital. And so this is all he does all day, is look at these things. And he's really good at spotting where they don't make sense. You know, and he's, despite the tone of some of his emails, which can be kind of abrupt, he's actually not a bad guy to talk to in person.
And
Go ahead.
two, you're limited on what it can be used on, correct? Like, for example, like we're just finding out like we couldn't use it like on our tree issue.
Right. I'm a little surprised to see that this has a line for tree work. If this
Yeah.
came from David, because the ROC Capital, the lender, did send out a memo in the beginning of the year that said, you know, they're not, I think if tree work was in your original capital
Mm.
improvement plan from day one, they have to honor that.
That could be. Yeah,
Um,
that's a good observation, right? We're not sure why
Yeah.
it's showing up. Marjorie, did you have other things in mind like that? Other than the trees, you know, that where this money's not available?
I see Dan's hand too. I don't know, he's kind of in the dark, so I don't know.
Yep.
I have something, I see the idea of capital reserve. And it is a good idea. It's a very good long-term idea. My
Well,
beef with
it's just that, like, for example, oh,
Oh, I think just some tech
Mar-
trouble.
Marjorie, hold that thought, and Dan, when you finish your thought.
my problem with it is what is classified as a capital expense.
Right.
And how do you forecast something a year or two, or at least a year early? Because if you want to spend the money as a capital expense, it has to be in the budget.
Mhm.
So if it's not in the budget and you think it's a capital expense, the response I've gotten is, well, you have to take it out of your operating account because it's not in the budget.
Right.
Well, how do you know a year before you're going to need that money to put it in the budget?
Right.
And also, what is a capital expense?
Yep.
Well, I think replacing a trailer is a capital expense.
Replacing sorry.
Home, a home.
Replacing a trailer, replacing a home
Yeah, I see.
should be a capital expense. Or even part of that operation, which would be after the footings or the base is put in, then you have to crown the site. That should be a capital expense because it's a long-term improvement to the community. But yet you have to know that a year in advance to put it in the budget.
You know, the rule of thumb that I have been told, and I don't remember who told me this, but that capital expenses are things that make the property better. So the home, while it is an investment that the co-op makes, it doesn't stay with the property. The lot prep does. The trees, I think it's an open fight, frankly. But you know, improvements to your community building or your storm shelter, that's a community-owned asset. So you have to put a new roof on it, that's a capital expense.
Or the electrical pedestals. How can you predict in advance how many you need to put in?
Yeah, you
Because-
can't. And that,
Well,
and I think,
Sometimes you can.
yeah,
It really depends on
you
the
know
situation.
you have vacant lot.
If you know that you need to replace a whole system, for instance, one of our communities here, it's large in terms of the amount of land. They have very large lots and it's 250 homes. And so they knew they had to replace their electrical systems, and that's a huge expense because having to cover so much ground. So they are phasing that over 5 years. So in that case, it's very predictable, right? Like it's part of a plan.
they're gonna do all of them.
They're going to
Sure.
do all of them over that period of time.
Sure. But
If you have one that, if you have one that goes out and you didn't expect that, right, that is a different story.
And I think that that's where you use this document really as a living document, and you can go in before you submit that reserve request. You go in and you put it in your CIP.
So I think, what I think is this, I think that it would be really smart to have a facilitated discussion with ROC Capital about this.
Yeah.
I don't think that they are necessarily all seeing all the aspects of it, or
Right.
even talking to each other all the time about it. I mean, our practice, the way we were trained was that the members approve the CIP at the same time that they approve the operating budget, in which case, then
Okay.
no, the board can't go in afterward, right?
That's true.
So there's kind of, yeah. And also, I mean, every community is going to have an unplanned capital expense at some point. That is called life. So I think that, the lender should have a helpful answer for that situation, right? So if that's not happening right now, that sounds to me like maybe it's a discussion that the ROC Association could facilitate, or, could have a role in helping make happen, because I think this is a question a lot of the communities would have.
Yeah, it's not unique to just the communities on this call.
Mm-hmm. So, sorry.
It gets to the point where you build up a certain amount of money in this account, and then you have to answer to the membership why it is you can't spend it. Why do you have to increase the lot rent instead of taking money out of that account for an expense?
I'll tell you one other thing, Daniel, that one of my communities does, just for convenience, and because they have a high level of trust, is they have opened separate savings accounts that they control.
Yeah. We have a community that's done that as well.
Yeah. Now, not every community, that wouldn't make sense in every community. This is one where, as I said, like the members have a lot of trust in the board. It's a step that that if you were in a less trustful situation, people might look askance at. Right.
Doesn't that, how does that fly with your debt ratio? I mean,
so it's a use that they've made of some of their surplus, so it doesn't affect that.
so you can take that money out of your operating account, and so long as it doesn't affect your debt ratio, you can still come up with, smelling good, looking good, smelling good.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. I mean, you have to have a community that is able to raise that kind of income. So
Mhm.
there are communities for which that is not going to be an option.
It's not real. Yeah. Sam, it looked like, did you have something else that you were going to contribute?
Yeah, I guess the kind of the way I think of it is, so there's like the sort of longer term replacements and upgrades, and then there's the shorter term maintenance and repairs. And it's a little bit mushy. Like ideally the longer term, which are also more expensive items, would be coming out of the replacement reserve, and the others would come out of your operating budget. But it depends on a lot of factors, especially based on sort of what got in the 10-year reserve, what got in when you reviewed it. But I think another consideration is just that, how much, sort of to go with what Dan was saying, how much money is in each account. So like if you're able to add a bit of money to your operational budget for emergencies or for things you think might come up, that's one way to do it. Or as Dan was saying, if you have plenty of money in your replacement reserve, maybe having that conversation with ROC Capital, say, hey, we're looking, we contribute a lot to it. There's a good balance in it. We're not going to use it for much over the next couple of years. So can we repurpose some of this money? But there is also a time sometimes where you may want to use the money in the reserve, but it is allocated for something else, and it needs to be saved for that, and or else you won't have too much left when you need it for that other thing. And and then it's also a question of like, sometimes there's things in the 10-year plan or 15-year plan that you don't plan to do. And so then taking them out and replacing them by things that the community does want instead. And so you can put those funds to better use. But yeah, I just think because I think what ROC Capital wants to see is like they want to make sure there is that savings account for big ticket items, because if you don't have it, then there could be a big expense that would have a big impact on lot rent. But I hear what Dan is saying, that the money's there. Why can't we use it? And then it would just be, I think, more follow-up about to clarify if it can be repurposed from what it was allocated towards.
Yeah, and that, in terms of timing, that seems like a great conversation to have maybe 4 months out from your annual meeting, right when you're starting to think about your budgeting for your operating budget. You would also want to have that discussion with the folks at ROC Capital to see if you really can make a significant adjustment to your capital improvement plan. One other thing I'll mention, and I don't know if it's an issue with any of the communities here on the call, but we occasionally see groups that just really don't want to spend their money at all. Which I think we can all relate to, probably. Right? But that also can go too far, because what that means is then you're not updating systems that you should be updating, and you're kind of like heading for a bigger fall instead. So it can be an understandable impulse to just save. But this is actually something else the lender is looking at is, are you maintaining the infrastructure? Are you actually maintaining the infrastructure? Are you actually, making the improvements that need to be made? So maybe, there might be something that was scheduled for year 3, and year 3 comes and the co-op feels like, we've looked at this and it can still last another few years. And that could be totally legitimate, but then you want to still plan to do it in year 5 or what have you.
And you might be, instead of facing a repair, you might be facing a replacement, which is going to be more costly.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe I'll take a minute to just talk a bit about, when you have those really large projects. And this is where it's very variable. It depends on the resources in your state. It depends on the interest rate, et cetera. But I think it's probably interesting for folks to know, some of the approaches that we've seen in Vermont and other states where we operate have been pretty creative. And I would say that this is a moment in history when a lot of states are trying to figure out how to be helpful to protect affordable housing. So, if folks are in a state that doesn't have a history of being that helpful to the ROCs, this could be a time when that could shift, with some effort, with some advocacy. So we have had, first of all, our Agency of Natural Resources sits on a huge amount of money, just a huge amount of money, because they are financing the drinking water and wastewater projects for all the municipalities. That's basically how a lot of the towns finance their work, the ones that, that have town systems. So there's a whole process set up for them, money that's available to them that comes from the EPA. And it's a mix of extremely low interest loans. In fact, some of the loans are 0%. With terms of 30 years, right? So in essence, they're paying you, or they're paying the lender, right? Because inflation is still happening. Other funding streams have, like a 2% loan. And some of them even have a component where the part of that money gets forgiven, it's converted into a grant at a certain point in the life of the process. So that's an incredible resource. We had to build that relationship and do some pushing, do some wooing, some courting, and some pushing, I would say, to kind of turn on the taps, so to speak, for that. We also have seen our communities able to get what's called Community Development Block Grant money. This is for housing, for affordable housing. And this is a grant program where the town where your community is has to be the applicant. The community can't apply directly. At least that's the case in our state. And I think that might also vary by state. So this is like a whole universe of programs that have a lot of complexity. They have a ton of hoops, not just to get the money, but then around how you can spend the money and how you find contractors. But when you're looking at a project of, a multi-million-dollar project, it sure is worthwhile, because what community could afford to self-finance that, right? So that's just kind of a realm to, I guess, be aware of, or talk with your CTAP about whether they see opportunities in those directions.
What do you know about like tax increment financing as it might be applied here?
Oh, well, that's an interesting. I haven't seen it applied to ROCs. I'm
Okay.
familiar with it, with that program. Actually, my city is one that uses that program. And so I'm no expert in it, but just to try to define it for everyone, tax increment financing is a mechanism where the borrower, whether it's a town, or I don't know if a ROC would qualify, but the borrower gets money that they promise to pay back out of an increased revenue stream. So like if you were doing infill, right? Let's say you had a good amount of infill you could do, that would bring in more revenue to your business, and you could pay back this financing out of that. So some people look askance at it. Probably people who are very financially conservative. But I've seen it in use in Vermont, and it certainly seems to function. So that would be an interesting thing to look at. And I'll tell you one other very creative thing that's happening in our state now, is that the treasurer decided to take a pot of money. Every state has money that they're investing, right? For various reasons. So our treasurer decided to take, a small amount of that and offer it as low interest mortgages for affordable housing communities, and the ROCs have been able to qualify for that. Now that was like one pot of money. It's not an ongoing thing. But
It could be a pilot project too, which
exactly. Yeah.
would be a proof of concept to some other organization.
Yeah, so one of our communities that has they have a big dig going on, replacing all their drinking water and septic and tying into the municipal systems. I mean, just like several $1 million project. They qualified for this mortgage, and that's been a huge help because they've had cost overruns as that work has been happening. So this is a big part of how they're gonna close that financing gap. So yeah, I mean, that's, a separate but related topic, but an important one for folks to be thinking about if they know that they have these big projects in their future.
Right.
Any other reflections or questions?
I mean, I'll throw one out there, and I don't know a lot about this, unfortunately, but for tree removal, apparently there is some money that comes through the DNR for fire suppression. And it's possible, depending upon where you are, I'm not sure that would, I don't know if Medelia could apply for that because of where they're located. They're not near, you know, a forest or something like that. But that might not preclude you, but some of our communities are in areas where there is a real fire danger. And it would behoove the greater community to get some of the dead wood out of those areas. So yeah, it's sort of about thinking about who else cares about whether or not this work gets done. Oh, Sam just posted to the chat of
Yeah,
the
this was from ROC Capital about
their memo.
this was what they said about tree removal expenses. I think it's been referenced a couple times.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have this one, Kathleen? I could email it to you to email to the group if that'd be helpful for people to have. It's on.
If it's at your fingertips, send it to me because I have it, but I'd have to go looking for it. Copy Ellery. Any
Any-
other questions, you all?
I'm curious if people, if there was new information here for people. First of all, or
Yes.
this is all stuff that people had seen before.
But it was nice getting an explanation of the long-term capital improvement program. You know, getting an overall explanation of that.
Great. Yeah, does it make you think you might shift, you know, how you approach your budgeting? You know, like, are you going to be folding this into next year's budgeting process more so, or doing some education for the board at that time?
We should
Well,
bring
Or
it
this year's.
forward. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because, yeah, I was under the impression it was we could play a little more fast and loose with this than we can.
But in the upcoming budget session, what I will be looking at is I already know we need to expend some money, you know, for capital improvement, but I just want to make sure that it's in the budget to begin with.
Mm.
And it is classified by ROC as a capital expense.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to make a distinction, Dan, with what you're saying is the budget largely is how you allocate your earned income, so your operating expenses, and the capital improvement plan is how you want to spend your reserves. Because if you are having something paid for from reserves or being reimbursed by reserves, it should never hit your balance sheet. So it should not be in the budget, but you should be accounting for it. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I guess my practice has probably not been the best, because for a lot of these expenses, I'll pay the bill right away first out of operating, and then try and get reimbursed out of capital expense. Well, if the decision then is it's not a capital expense, then that affects the operating budget.
Yeah. And what
Can I just
Peter-
add, Kathleen,
Yeah.
sorry. Coming back to, you know, Dan's question about, well, how do you anticipate, right? One thing I have seen some groups do where they have wiggle room is kind of bulk up the capital improvement plan for the year with whatever they think they might want.
if you don't
and then
spend
they
it,
don't do it. If they don't spend it, that's fine, right? But if it turns out that they want to, it's in there, it was pre-approved.
I have been told that the most you can spend out of your capital improvement plan is about 50%.
Yeah.
Can you forecast you know, say I just pull some numbers out of my ear, like we're gonna replace 10 trailers next year. And we have a history now of how much that'll cost. We have an idea of how much replacing one is, and we just put that in the budget. Well, what's in the capital expense budget doesn't necessarily affect what's in the operating budget.
Right.
I
That-
mean,
I mean,
What
also,
you
I
have
would
to
say-
do what you have to do at that point is make sure that if you put that big number from your ear in your capital in your capital improvement plan for year 7, that by the time you get to year 10, you still have a balance. So that's the guardrail on doing what you're suggesting, because yeah, that sounds pretty sweet, but it's not open-ended.
And also, if you're I mean, it sounds like, Dan, part of what you're talking about is doing infill or replacing, maybe you have old homes or abandoned homes, if they're park-owned homes. That could just be more costly than what your reserves can support. And that might be a time when the co-op would have to look at, some other type of project loan.
Right. A
Right.
revolving line of credit.
Yep.
A grant from a philanthropy, some other
source. Yeah.
'cause
Yeah.
Our budget wouldn't support 2 or 3 trailer replacements. No.
Mhm. But it might well pencil out, as they say, that if you got some kind of line of credit, that would pay for the first 3 or 4, and you put those in, and as long as you're in a market where those are going to produce revenue soon, that will then enable you to pay on that line of credit. Right. So, but I think the bigger takeaway is the reserves are necessary, and you want to be paying attention to them, but they're necessary, but not sufficient for every need that a community is going to have.
And I think that 50% number is not a hard and fast, you won't find that written down anywhere in ROC's paperwork. But observationally, because we all talk to each other, that's a rule of thumb.
Okay.
Julia, I came in a bit late. Do you have the link to the new template?
Yeah, I think, Kathleen, do you mind? Or I put it in the Slack, but maybe I just put it to Kathleen. So
Yeah, I sent
Okay,
it out
yeah.
to
Well, I came in late, so I might have
Sure.
not
In
got
your
that part of the
inbox.
check.
Yeah, I think it's in your inbox, and if it's not, I'll share it with you.
And actually, what
Oh,
what
okay.
you should know, Sam, is that the document I sent out is just half of the new template. I took their sample tab
Oh,
and they played with it a little bit, but they also have a blank tab. So, I mean, David Eady, it seems like this is a kind of like a round robin where David Eady was maybe drawing on some of your work, and then,
well,
made
that's how
some
you make the best
refinements.
product, right?
Yep. Any other closing thoughts? Anything that still feels unclear that could use, maybe a little follow-up?
Bev and Keith have been pretty quiet. Anything you want to chime in with?
I live in a whole different reality.
Yep,
not-
me too.
We're not financed by ROC. And
Uh-huh.
That's true.
we don't have any reserves. I wonder if I have enough money for stamps every 3 months.
Oh, gosh. Okay.
We are really starting out, we're only 2.5 years old, we're toddlers. And we have the preliminary evaluation of the property and what we needed to do. And all of the costs were doubled by the time we became a co-op. And
Mhm.
so I'm lived through the COVID. That's when we
They're COVID
Um,
babies.
became, right, a cooperative through COVID. And so we're managing, we're
Mhm.
fortunate, we're in Minnesota, and they have granted a tremendous amount of money for us to receive for our infrastructure improvements. And that's what we're operating with.
Yep.
Our grant money.
Yep.
That's drying up.
Bev has also done a great job of creating liaisons with the city of Richfield.
Yep. Our city has also granted us improvement money and assisted us in another grant program where we can add 3 double wides in conjunction with the city and the Met Council. So we're operating totally differently than the rest of you folks are.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, and I mean, I think this could be something to kind of, you know, a goal for the future, and especially if you're adding homes, you know, that at some point you'll see more revenue. That you know, when there is a little wiggle room, it's good to keep in mind that this would be a great thing to start at that point.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's the goal.
Mhm.
Absolutely. I do understand, you know, the necessity of the spreadsheets. Absolutely. And I do analyze all of our reports
Nice.
thoroughly. So thank you for that little share.
Yeah, thanks for giving us a little glimpse of what you're dealing with. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming on the call. It's definitely been useful to me to talk it out.
Thank you very much for all your efforts. Appreciate it.
Very welcome. I love helping people who help themselves. It's just a joy.